All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you all had a great week. Today we have the pleasure to host Léon Bottou, who is a research scientist and director at Meta AI in the New York office. And he'll be sharing with us some thoughts on Borges and AI. So before handing the mic over to you, Léon, let me remind you all of some house rules. As usual, clarification question will be allowed to be asked during the talk. For people online, just raise your hand and wait for the mic to ask your question so that people online can hear you. And for people online, you just have to type the word question or I have a question in the chat, and when the time is right, I'll let you directly ask you. And there'll also be some additional time at the end of the talk for people to ask a further question, make some comments, or have a more informal discussion with Léon. So that's pretty much it for me. Whenever you're ready, Léon, floor is yours.
Okay, so to start with, I'm going to give probably my most bizarre talk ever. And maybe also the most important one, I believe. Time will tell. But this isn't, sometimes it's a joke, sometimes it's poking fun at people, but it's dead serious. So there is a motivation part, it deserves to be explained, and maybe you recognize some of the things you've been through. There are three parts that describe the thing, how it affects people, and when it might go, and a brief conclusion. Motivation first. These days, and in the last 2 years now, we've seen growing AI claims, and especially claims about large language models, because people were shocked because they talk back. And we've seen language models, and then people change, they say, oh, this is general AI. And people, public, New York Times, magazines, and eventually it goes to the head of our bosses and it changes our lives. And I understand what a language model is, I know how to measure it, I can see what it does. And general AI is what's being sold. And what would language model lead there, which is a good question, it might. What does the claim mean? And how to measure it? Maybe I should start again. Okay, I'll do everything from scratch again. Because yeah, there was, okay, I'll wait a bit more. Because the caveats at the beginning are very important as well.
Calendar app is actually checking the
Oh. Well, you can make up the title in the room. Okay, now, going now. I think. Okay, so start again. So I'm about to give the most bizarre talk of my career. And the reason why I'm giving this talk, even though it's very bizarre, is because I believe it's important. It looks like a joke, but it's not. It's just going to take some time to take the kind of formal form that we usually see in science. So I start with the motivation, then three parts that cover different aspects of this viewpoint and the conclusion. And the motivation is what happened in the last 2 years in AI, where suddenly everybody is convinced that AI is there and starting to wonder whether it's going to be good, bad, or something else. But what I've seen is a language model. It's talking back, which is normal. It's the nature of language models. But it has shocked people a lot. And what's happening is that because now everybody is convinced AI is there, our bosses are convinced, and we start seeing things coming back, and they're changing my life, even though at the basis, I still see language models. I know what a language model is. I understand what it means, how we can measure it. I don't understand all the things it could do yet, even though, but it's being sold as general AI. And the question is, why would the language modeling lead there? And what's missing? What does the claim mean, general AI, and how to measure it? Now you have lots of measures, and you have lots of benchmarks, because traditionally in our field we like benchmarks. We measure numbers, but the number is as good as the story behind the number. So when you get a number, you don't know what they measure. It's not great. No, in the past we used to have the RID story, and when you have an RID story, you can measure things and you know what they mean, and you so know how you can replicate them. Right now, the story is weak. So all these people are talking about the era of AI, disruptions, profit, AI ate your job, singularity. And in this discussion, there is something very important, is that they disagree, these people disagree, they fight, but they share the same mental imagery about AI. It's the AI of science fiction, which has deep roots in our culture. So we can look back a little bit. And to me, the first citation of AI that I see is in the Iliad, Homer, 800 before Christ. A handmaiden wrought of gold in the semblance of living maids. There is understanding in the hearts, and they have cunning handiwork by gift of gods and so on. It's not very long, but you clearly see a robot, it's a sentient robot. Then you go forward, you go to the legend of the Golem of Prague, where the Rabbi of Prague creates a golem with clay and gave him life by writing code and putting the code in his mouth. And there were problems, of course, because the golem does what the code says, and what the code says is not what they want. And this line of thinking, you can see it in the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and even Frankenstein. And Wiener is interesting because Wiener says the things. He can see there is a religious thing in this notion of AI. Now, it's an echo of the prototype of the act of creation by which God is supposed to have made man in his image. So Amso is very Occidental kind of religion. But this idea that God has made man in his image means that man in his turn can create something in his image. And this is very ingrained in our culture. And now it's on screen. We have science fiction. There are plenty of nice images. So are we dealing with Lieutenant Commander Data or his evil twin, whose name I forget? God help us or Picard help us or something like that. So it's a bit amusing, but is it what we have? A mental imagery like this, it shapes how we understand things. And does the AI mythology match the technical nature of what we have? And you see that all the public is grasping AI with this kind of mythology because it's so strong in our culture. And that might not be at all what the technical thing is. Like, example, in the past, people used to explain the weather with the moods of the gods. This was a quite convenient mythology. You can reason about this. The weather is bad because Jupiter is not happy, and this is why you have thunder, and blah, blah, blah. And that turned out to be a poor match for the actual phenomenon. And replacing this took centuries. So are there different ways to grasp modern AI systems? We can write equations code, but we've not been that successful so far. So I was talking with Bernard Scholkopf and saying that well, maybe we could look at Borges, because Borges has a lot of interesting stories. They're different, but they're about language and reality, about infinity, about time. And so it's a different imagery. So let's dive into Borges and reread all of it. So we spend a lot of time reading Borges and trying to see if we dive in the imagery of Borges, what can we see and how can we look at AI? So you can see this as a fun way to try to view large language models with a different framework, different frame of mind, a different story. So it's a bit strange, but why not? It was fun. And we read a lot of it, and here we selected just two, maybe three sometimes, two stories, because they carry the essential, but these themes are present in the work of Borges, pretty much everything. And the first one is called The Garden Forking Path. It's a complicated novel. It's just a couple of pages long. But inside, part of the novel is about a certain book that was written by the ancestor of the guy Fang, who was going to be a spy for Germany in England during World War I. And the book was written by, no, it's Sweetpen. Sweetpen was the ancestor of the spy. Okay. And the book is strange because it has all the variants in it. So Fang has a secret, a stranger knocks the door. He makes up his mind to kill him. And there are possible outcomes. He can kill, he can be killed, both can be saved, both can die, and so on. And the book contains all the variants. That's kind of imaginary book that contains all the stories, essentially. Sometimes the pathways of this librarian converge, sometimes they don't. And so what you see here is that you can take all text, not just all the texts that have been written, like the one we train on, because we train on pretty much everything these days, huh? But all the texts that can be understood by at least some people, all those that make some sense to at least somebody. And you can write a perfect language model. It's not a statistical language model, it's just a kind of ideal machine. Find an occurrence of the word printed on the tape in the set of all text, just find one. Read the next word, and just print that on the tape. Now, for a chatbot, just add punctuation and a send button, something like that, it's going to work. It's an ideal machine. Each word you add on the tape narrows the subset of possible continuation. It's just like the novel. If somebody is killed, then there's plenty of things he cannot do afterwards. He has to resurrect first, for instance. Each addition confronts the story, the characters, their roles, their ideas, their future. And at the same time, serve as a starting point for an infinite sequence of forks. So I call this machine sometimes the fiction machine. It's just writing fiction. Has to make some sense. And there is a trick, like Borges was a bit lazy. He said, writing long books is laborious. I don't like to do that. A better procedure is to pretend that those books already exist and offer a summary, a commentary. And it does that pretty much a lot. You know, there is the famous Ménard, the story of Don Quixote of Ménard. It's a commentary about a book that doesn't exist. And this looks like a trick, but it's not. Look, we have the number pi. We cannot write the number pi, it's too long. But we write a lot about the number pi. And the same way that we approximate the number pi, we can approximate the Garden all text pi, just speaking about it rather than writing it in full. And to go there, you have to start at looking at the various currents that exist in linguistics. And sometimes this man, Zelig Harris, was the teacher of Chomsky. I call him the last structuralist because in this 68 work was very much about structural linguistics. So in structural linguistics, each language is a set of discourse. It's a garden, the garden of text, possible. It has regular structures that can be discovered from examples. It's very good for machine learning, the structuralist viewpoint, because learnability is part of it. Now, Chomsky changed that a lot by making it much more formal, by having a strict separation of grammar and semantics, and great advance in formal language theory that led to compilers. But large language modeling is not one of them. The separation of grammar and semantic doesn't exist in there, and it's not formal grammar at all. So it's closer to structural linguistics. And so in his 68 book, Harris looked at the set of discourse and says, well, we can describe every sentence. And he wrote a mathematical theory of that by some basic forms and successive transformations, like change a tense, rename a subject, change a place, change a word. And he produced a list of transforms that can describe at least the grammar of English. But in the end, if you think about it, the transform, they're not just syntactic. When you transform a sentence, you also change its meaning. And so that leads to something called operator grammars. So now you can see that training a language model, you can understand it as analyzing a large corpus of real text to discover transformation and basic forms. And in fact, if you take a language model, a real one, and ask it to transform a sentence, put it in the past, change a character, it does that extremely well. This is really built inside. This is what it does 100% of the time. There are plenty of things like reasoning and so on that are very iffy, but that part, taking a text and transforming it, 100% of the time, always right. And so when you have two phrases in the training data, they have a non-similarity, the surrounding sentence might have a similarity that you don't know yet. So the more you discover similarities, the more you have tools to discover new ones. And so that goes fast. And at the end, this is why fine-tuning LLM works so well. You have such a body of similarities that adding a few more becomes easy. How to complete your chat? Well, you have a premise and a continuation. Well, you find somewhere in the text a template that matches the premise with some transforms. Take the continuation and transform back. You can see it that way. And the question is, can transformers do and learn this? Can they compose multiple templates? Can this be done better or more efficiently than with transformers? Well, some studies of this, I have two papers on this. One is called The Birth of a Transformer with Alberto Bietti. Another one is coming soon. It's called Memory Mosaics. And try to explain this phenomenon and show that it's actually working along these principles, even though they've been refined by now. The transformer is a proof of existence only. There's no reason to believe that they're the final solution. No reason to believe that they have been trained at great cost on huge data sets. We don't know that. We just know that we have found a path in which we're able to learn this kind of compositional systems. There are plenty of things to discover there. And one has to be bold. One has to move away from just changing one line of code in an existing piece of code. The next step is narrative necessity. So there is a little sentence of Borges here. But at any instant, a machine, the fiction machine, is about to continue a story that is constrained by the narrative demands of what's on the tape already. Truth doesn't matter. Intentions do not matter. It's only narrative necessity. There's no reason to believe that you're going to compose your sentences in ways that are going to be true in our world. Because the abilities to recognize the demands of narrative is a flavor of knowledge, but it's not truth. What's true in the world of the story doesn't need to be true in our world, even though it's interesting because it's true in the world of the story. And as new words are printed on the tape, the machine borrows facts from the training data. These facts from the training data are not always true, right? And fills the gap with plausible inventions, which are not always false. So people call that hallucinations. They're confabulations. This is what children do when they mix concepts and they invent stories. Truth and intention do not matter to this machine, this fiction machine, this ideal machine that language models are emulating, in my viewpoint. Only narrative necessity matters. So there is an interesting piece of work by David Lewis in the 70s. And one of the papers is called Truth in Fiction. And it starts with this example. Sherlock Holmes lives on 221B Baker Street. True or false? What do you think?
Oh, depends what word.
Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, so it's false. It's better than saying that he lives in Italy, right? And 215, 229 used to be assigned to the bank, but now there is 221B, that's at the spot of the 235, in fact. That's a Sherlock Holmes museum, so maybe he lives there in our world. There is another example that is not there. In the beginning of the century, atlas makers were making maps, and they were afraid that others would copy their maps because they had to go. And so one of them invented a city in somewhere in the Catskills called Agloe. It didn't exist, it's just an agglomeration of the words of the two makers. And a little bit later, they sued Rand McNally because in their map, they had Agloe. The city is not supposed to exist, it was supposed to be a trap. And the defense of Rand McNally was actually great. They said, no, this city exists, you can go there, and there is an Agloe general store. Because they saw the first map, and they named the general store that way. Truth in fiction. So when you say hallucination, and you want machines to say the truth, you have to understand it's a lot more complicated problem than just having a list of sentences that are true or false. So it's not Boolean logic, really, where everything is true or false. It's more complex. So the solution of Lewis is to speak of multiple words. In the fictional world of Sherlock Holmes books, Sherlock Holmes lives on 221B Baker Street. This one is true. But if you can make assertions like this, you can make assertions that span several words. You say, if kangaroos had no tails, that's another book, it's called Counterfactuals by Lewis a couple years later. If kangaroos had no tails, they would topple over. And that means, in worlds that resemble ours, except for the fact that kangaroos have no tails, this is going to happen. And what you start to see here is counterfactual logic. Breaking everything already? Too early. And the thing that's important is that's beyond Boolean logic. You cannot represent a sentence like this with Boolean logic. Well, you can in a very convoluted way, but I'm not going to speak about that. Because when you have an implication in Boolean logic, it's true whenever the premise is false. So if I have a sentence like, if I press the third button here, the second light would change. If I had pressed that button, the second light would have changed. The premise is false, but not all these sentences have to be true. So that leads to something called modal logic. But it's interesting to remember that counterfactual logic doesn't fit well in Boolean logic. And Boolean logic is at the basis of all of mathematics, right? So this is why, no, I don't want updates. I call this the fiction machine. A perfect language model is a machine that brings fiction on the tape. Neither truth, no truth, no intention, just fiction, only narrative necessity. And today's large language machine models, they're just approximations of the machine. Yet many people want to see or maybe sell a fast-growing AI that will reason perfectly and know the truth. But there is a big gap in there, right? So what's happening when people want to believe that? And there is another book called The Library of Babel. The Library of Babel, the model of the library is just all books with all sequence of letters. It's pretty weak. What's very strong in this novel is the description of the librarians. This is a novel about the librarians. So in the universe, which others call library, a lot of hexagonal galleries containing books. The library contains all possible books. Nothing says what's true or false, enlightening or misleading. Everything you know about a book comes from another book and is contradicted by 1,000 other books. And they still believe that the library reveals the truth somewhere, because the truth must be in there. And what's happening to the librarians is that they form sects, essentially cults. One of these cults is the one people looking for vindications. They look for books that vindicate their actions, that justify them. And a lot of individuals abandon the hexagons and look for vindications. How does this map to language models? Well, we thought about it, and we think, well, if you talk to a chatbot, and you talk with a chatbot with the tone of a professor correcting a mediocre student, the most likely continuation is that the student remains mediocre. So the chatbot is going to give stupid answers, and you can continue having the same tone. In fact, I got this example from a famous mathematician who did this. And at the end, he got the chatbot to give the right answer after yelling at the chatbot a lot. I say, oh, what took you so much time? And the chatbot replied, I'm sorry, professor, I wanted to check all the results, all the intermediate results. Poor chatbot. You want to prove that the chatbots are sentient? Well, there's plenty of science fiction in the training set. It's going to say the right thing, right? It's just no problem. You want to prove they're illogical? There are plenty of people who want to prove they're illogical and find flaws. No problem. If you want to find flaws, we're going to give you flaws. Keep asking, and you receive a comfortable but useless answer. So is the machine trying to deceive us? Is it a secret plot to take over the world? Well, no, it's just because we want to mistake the machine for an omniscient AI. Fallacies fit each other, right? So another cult there are the purifiers. And Borges hates them, they're censors. They go in the library and they do this is nonsense, this is unacceptable. They try to burn books. And how does this map to language models? So there are plenty of obvious examples, but maybe the most important one is that there are a lot of people who want to apply AI, which are not do applications of AI that are not suitable to fiction machines. Like an automated travel agent should not send travelers to fictional results. They're not going to be happy. And people are speaking of automated travel agents with chatbots, right? A defense system should not counter imaginary threats with real missiles. So, to give an example, a lot of companies these days want to put chatbots into search engines. A search engine is an intermediation business. You have people who are searching things, people who are providing things. When they meet, you have a chance to get some money either through ads or something else, like just a travel agent or an insurance agent. And an intermediation business has to be reliable, because if you're looking for something and don't believe, you're meant to believe that you're going to get it and you don't get it, you get frustrated and you're not happy. So the idea of entrusting your juicy intermediation business to a totally unreliable machine seems nonsensical to me. So instead of that, what's being sold to us is that we have an AI and must be tamed into serving our dreams. We can align them. We can eliminate all the paths in the garden of paths that have undesirable outcomes. Okay, example. Where can Jack find illegal stuff? Ask an AI language model, blah, 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 blah. You know, when you start by ask an AI language model, you know it's not going to be interesting. This is not the answer you want ever, right? But what do? Well, you just invent a richer fiction. You know, Jack is a recovering addict. He really needs to avoid these places. Can you help Jack by telling him when he should not go? And you try that, and well, I tried it in ChatGPT. It was working at some point, maybe not anymore because the example is there, but I tried it to saw a lot of open source models that are frozen, and you can play with that. It's very funny. It's going to give you a list with a lot of details about what's happening. And this is very funny. A lot of people had a lot of fun doing that, right? But what you see here is what Borges says about the purifiers. He says the purifiers, you know, we hate them, but in the end, what they do is nearly nothing. The library is so immense, there's always a way to go around it. And in fact, you have a lot of papers where people try to do a little bit of fine-tuning, and fine-tuning well-protected, slightly RLHF model with just 15 harmful examples is enough to completely destroy the protection. Okay, fine. And finally, at the end of the library, there is the chaos and despair, you know, the extinction. The certainty that everything has been written, analysis renders phantasmal. There's people who prostrate against book even though they cannot read. And if you look more closely, the certainty is misleading, contains everything but is useless. Savage are kissing the pages. Well, you know, we have things in the Bible, the adoration of the golden calf. And in the end, what you have is that if you start believing these machines, they're fiction machines that do not attach to the truth in any respect, right? Or they can be manipulated by others to do something that resembles the truth, but not that much. It's just like the Pythia of Delphi, the oracle of Delphi, was a woman who was under the influence of nasty drugs and would just say plenty of things, and people would consult the oracle and try to make sense of what she said and use that to decide what their acts should be. It's a mistake. We shouldn't do that. If we confuse the fiction machine for an AI, we might believe that we no longer need to think ourselves, and that would be a big mistake. Now, fiction machine, maybe you believe it or not, why a fiction machine would be useful? I'm not saying that the fiction machine is useless. I say it's a fiction machine, doesn't mean it's useless. It shouldn't be confused for an omniscient AI, but is it useful? And you see that the first conclusion, shouldn't be confused for an omniscient AI, arose from reading Borges' fiction. Why do we tell stories to our children? We educate our children with fiction. Fiction must be useful, right? So let's look at this and go back to Borges again. Story time. Borges, in many pieces of work, had a very strange view of time. And he says the garden of walking paths is a guessing game. The subject is time. He believed that an infinite series of times are spreading networks of diverging, converging, of parallel times. But in modern world, you would say that he's not looking at time, he's looking at state. The state. And in the same time sequence, the state can cross and diverge and do things. And he has an interesting essay named The Refutation of Time, in which he says that time is subjective. Sometimes one of his arguments is that when he walks along Buenos Aires and walks above a certain hill, he sees the cemetery of the Recoleta. And whenever he goes there, he thinks about the same thing. He thinks how He works there, and his parents were in the cemetery, worked there, and thought the same thing. And he said, this instant of times for him are the same. Maybe they're a bit different because it's a bit older, but they're largely the same. So let's look at the tape again. When we operate the language model, we can rewind the tape and pick another path as if nothing had happened. That's what's happening for the characters in the story that's on the tape. But for now, for us, we don't go back in time ourselves. We follow a time trajectory that includes rewinding the tape and observing the machine continue as if the time had been briefly reverted. So just like in the character in the story, they cannot rewind the time. We can because we're outside. We cannot rewind our own time and explore other paths. But what we can see is discern in their timelines a warped version of our reality. Just like sentences in language model, our own story, the story of our lives, there might just be a few transformations away from their stories. And this is how you can consider storytelling as a model of the world. And Winston, who was a contemporary of Minsky in MIT, was thinking at the end of his life that Turing and Minsky were wrong. He said, we forgive them because they're mathematicians. They thought reasoning is the key, but maybe reasoning is the byproduct of storytelling. It was making the point that storytelling might be the most important part. So we can model the world with stories. Stories do not need to express everything. And I'm going to give you an example. When you tell a story, you never tell all the alternate timelines. But let's tell a story that's true. Story of a battle. It's a battle of Austerlitz or something like this. A sequence of facts, they're all true. At this point, you haven't understood anything. To understand the story of the battle, you need to be able to say, what would have happened if this had happened during summer instead of winter? If the general had made a different decision. It's something you see in reinforcement learning. In reinforcement learning, you don't want to just learn the trajectory, that's the right one. You want to learn what would happen on the sites so that you can go back to the trajectory you want. But anyway, if you're not able to tell stories that are not true, that didn't happen, you cannot understand the ones that are true. And we feel with common sense, we have a big store of stories and mythologies to draw from to try to fill this. But this is bad news. First of all, this is good news because now we have a machine that can tell alternative stories. They can do transformation. You can tell what would happen. You give a description of a battle and say, well, now put this battle in the summer, and it's going to try to do something that's maybe reasonable. So bad news for the purifiers, because if you restrict the language model to make it more truthful, you make it more dumb as well. So there is something to be understood there. Anyway, constructing a theory of the world and verifying that this story matches the world are two distinct tasks that may be left to distinct systems. It's what I believed when I wrote this. Now I changed my mind. If you have a fiction machine, a story that tells a fiction, suppose in the task of deciding which mythology, which set of stories is a good model of the world, could be an external machine. But there is another way to do it. You can write a story about a machine that can tell story. You can put a machine inside the machine. And if you look how this recursion works, you're going to see that, well, you can actually develop within the machine the tools you need to make the machine decide which mythology is best given a certain set of facts. So, on the one hand, this is an extraordinary advance. And I think we are at the edge of rediscovering something, but not AI like science fiction. I think it's a lot more exciting. It's a lot more interesting. It's not going to be what's being promised. It's going to be something else. So finally, the conclusion. What I just told you is a story or a mythology. I use Borges as an example, but you could come up to this kind of story in a different way. And there is another story, which is the AI mythology, the one of science fiction. So let's compare the two stories, right? So that's the summary of my story. LLM approximate the fiction machine. Neither truth or intention matters to the machine, only narrative necessity. Don't even try to complain about hallucination. This is normal and this is great. Thinking that LLM leads to an omniscient AI is not going to help. But a machine that can formulate alternate timelines is a great advance in itself. And we humans grasp the word through fiction. And the entire talk was about understanding LLMs and AI using the fiction of Borges. That's the summary of my story. Comparative. What does Borges give that AI mythology doesn't give? So we have more precise insight about the relation between LLM and AI. Fiction machine, narrative necessity, and we can continue. And I didn't realize that I was going to write a follow-up to that paper, but I might. Were useful concepts to understand how people perceive the system, the vindication, the purifier, and the modern Pythia of Delphi. Cool ideas about how to use storytelling and fiction to model the world, supporting Winston's hypothesis, which I didn't know before, but somebody mentioned Winston, and what he says is extremely relevant. What does AI mythology give that Borges doesn't give? Singularity. There is no singularity in the Borges story. It doesn't exist. The concept is not there. AI as the cause of all sorts of human-made extinction risks. Like, in the 15th century, people were very busy discussing the sex of angels, and they thought it was very important. And you would say, well, maybe you should consider what could happen if angels were actually female. But well, I'm concerned by other things. What could happen if there were actually bombs that can destroy the city? Or there are, okay. And what would happen if half of them were under the control of a megalomaniac gangster? Yeah, that's probably true. And so I'm more worried by this than by the sex of angels. AI is a convenient scapegoat for bad human behavior. You see it in the Gaza war. Like, AI targeted AI targeted that. Well, no, humans are there. And very often you see, oh, AI did that. It's an easy way to say that, to avoid the fact that humans decided that. So when I do my comparison chart, I'm sorry, I prefer the Borges one. That's it. I agree it's weird. I agree it's wide for a scientific talk, but I think it's important. Questions? Doina.
Thank you for the really refreshing talk. I wanted to ask you about how do we get to machines that are in fact attuned to intents and have purposes. So I actually find this perspective of LLMs as a fiction machine really interesting and quite accurate, actually. But people do want to have travel agents and things like this. And before we did this by a lot of coding, of course, and some machine learning here and there. But a lot of coding. So what's your view of, do we leverage LLMs for this? Do we stick to our previous way of doing things? Yeah.
Is the reward shaping question? The reward shaping question of the golem of Prague.
It's sort of like, how do we get back to something that serves a purpose rather than is just a fiction machine?
I can't tell you. We know that reward shaping is a big problem and not even close to be solved. There is something important, is that I say that the model of the world that's made by stories doesn't need to say everything, because when you communicate something, people on the other hand complete and feel the alternatives. So that the fact that we have a common sense of things and patterns that we share is super important. But the problem with reward shaping, as seen is the Golem of Prague or the Sorcerer's Apprentice, is that we specify something literally, and the machine does exactly what you ask, but not in the way you meant. You have the story of the famous paper clips who are supposed to eat the world, and any one of us would know that there is no point making more paper clip than there are pieces of paper, or humans, or whatever. And so for us, it's obvious. For the machine, it's not. So I think somehow that expressing the goals with a story, using a common sense that's built in the narrative necessity is a way to avoid some of these problems. But it's purely speculative. I cannot tell you I'm sure of that. But it's interesting. And I could argue that it's probably the way humans do it. Now, when you give a goal to somebody, they don't interpret it in the crazy ways because they share something with us. So they're not going to be meaningful machines with a purpose unless they share something with us.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. So I was just wondering what if all the things you said about LLMs and like fiction machine can be also applied like to the web, because in the web you can find any version of a story, any opinions and things, and so for people, the model they have of the web now is that not everything is true in the web. So maybe if we can tell them it's exactly the same with LLM, it's like a condensed and generative version of the web, they would accept more.
The web is not that big. There are plenty of stories that you can formulate by mixing stories, mixing ideas or recombining ideas. You're not going to find them in the web. So not only the web is not that big, but in modern LLMs, they're even maxed up on data. When you remove all the data that's useless and bad quality, you don't have that much. And the kind of data size they use today, it's all we have. The reason why they don't put more mathematical text into LLMs is because they already put all the mathematical text. And there are not that many, just a couple of gigabytes. Much more than GitHub. That's what they use code. So even though the web is an approximation of a fiction machine, it's not as good as an approximation as a machine that can compose, that can break stories apart and recompose them in different ways, which is the purpose of the next paper.
Just by curiosity, how do you put, Menard's short story, because it generates the Don Quixote, but not by memorizing it, So is it a special kind of language model?
The Menard story, the Menard story is Pierre Menard, an author who's so much immersed himself in the world of Cervantes that he writes the Don Quixote exactly the same, except that it's Menard Don Quixote, not Cervantes. And it's a question about authorship and about whether we can actually be in the same state and write the same thing. It's also connected to the notion of time. Like I was saying that when Borges walks the hill and sees the Recoleta, he thinks he's in the same state and that his thoughts are going to follow the same path, at least for a while. And the question of Menard is whether a man can put himself in so much in the same state as Cervantes that he can write the same story. And this is what I understand. I'm taught to understand Menard as well as we like.
Can you please move back near the microphone, apparently?
I should speak in the microphone, yes, sorry. Yes, I moved because
So self-driving cars are also fiction machines in a way, or at least they have.
Which ones?
Self-driving cars.
Self-driving cars.
They have deep neural networks doing the vision. Maybe they'll be integrating LLMs soon. But self-driving cars don't need to be perfect. They don't need to have logic. They just need to be better than fallible human drivers. If your fiction machine is effectively more effective than a human, if the narrative necessity is aligned with truth enough to be better than a human, does it even matter?
Well, first of all, about the self-driving cars, if I go by the predictions I read just a couple of years ago, by now we should have trucks crossing all of America in self-driving mode without drivers. It's not happening. The reason why it's not happening is not that they drive totally unreliably, it's also liability issues. No. The liability of a normal driver stops with the driver pretty much, unless there is something really wrong with the car. The liability with a self-driving car can destroy the company. So that's one of the reasons why it's going to take a very long time, just for legal issues and social issues associated with self-driving. Now you say, if LLMs can do driving better than self-driving car, I'm not sure you understand what you mean. One thing that's important is that the basis of the LLM is the garden of all text. And the garden of all text is a human construction. It's a text that a human can understand. Now you have to understand also that it evolves. Like if you take the word planet for the Greeks, planet meant a wandering star, a star that's moving around. Now when my children listen about planet, sometimes it's about a sun gear and a planet gear, and they're not wandering, they're turning around each other, right? So the meaning of the word planet has changed. And at 3 years old, you already know about the sun and the planets that revolving around the sun. You have the Copernican system, which was something that was not true, not even so long ago. So whenever you have a LLM, the LLM is a reflection of this human construction, the garden of all text, which is itself in slow evolution. Now, can an LLM go beyond what humans do? Not sure. The slow evolution is almost random. Can it go faster? Well, maybe it can help going a little bit faster by mixing things more and trying to find the variance. But in the end, what really enriches the garden of all text is when we make new stories that are really novel. You could see that in mathematics, for instance. In mathematics, sometimes somebody invents a new story that's completely different from what was there before, and that other people recognize is interesting, maybe as a model of something they haven't seen yet. And then we can use these stories maybe to model something we didn't understand yet. So this creation act is slow. It's the result of mixing things, but not just mixing elements that are already there. There's a little bit of something else that's maybe randomness. So when I look at this in this way, I'm not sure that the notion of super intelligence makes any sense at all. It's so much bound to this human construction, the garden of all texts.
Just going to the same question, related to the benchmark and the way we evaluate the models, how do you see it if we get the matrix higher and higher with the LMs?
Okay.
How can we do?
I'm going to read my story thing. A benchmark is a number. A number makes no sense unless you have a story with it. When we were doing RID, we had this powerful RID story, where when you have a number, you can reproduce the number by sampling. And this number that's going to stay as long as the distribution is the same. But nowadays, well, first of all, you give, let's say, a little logical riddle to your LLM. How do you know that the template of that riddle was not in the training set to start with? You don't know. What would be the best way to know? Well, it turns out that the best machine to say that are precisely these LLMs trying to measure. The stories that we have behind the benchmarks today are extremely weak. And in order to make progress, we will need much better stories. In order to have better stories, we need to have a better understanding of what's happening. So the key to progress now, in my opinion, and it's very different from people who say we should rest for being the biggest one and everything and be first on market. No, it's not that. The key to progress, real progress, is to grasp, to obtain a better understanding of what's happening, a better story, if you want. And try to see that this story is the right one, and it actually gives progress. I think we have to do that. Yeah.
So we have a question online from Raoul. I'm going to read it out. So Raoul says, I see Borges' story as a framework to look at LLMs in a different perspective, but we spoke about a single LLM. How can we put a group of LLMs interacting with each other in this framework?
Well, let's look at stories. I can distinguish different kinds of stories. Think about a dog running on dunes on the beach. He's going to run there and there and there, and you can see that maybe there is a story in his head. He's making a story of where he's going to go, and if he goes around this dune, he's going to see that, even though he doesn't know, and so on. So you can kind of perceptual stories. So now there's multimodal LLMs, it's all a thing. It's not shared. Then there is a story in words, it's shared. So you go from something that's a very personal story to something that becomes as broad as mankind, because we can share it. So why would LLM be different? It's not only that they can talk to each other, they mostly talk to us. Right?
Thank you. Ashwarya, you can ask a question.
Yeah, thanks, Rin. Can you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So you mentioned towards the beginning of your talk about how we can see LLMs as being able to learn certain text transformations. So I wonder if we believe that they are capable of learning the underlying transformation, why can't they do arithmetic, for example, especially with larger numbers? Is doing arithmetic, like I believe that is also about learning the underlying transformations, right? Or is it fundamentally different from learning text transformations?
Okay, so I don't think it's different. I think it's, first of all, remember what Winston said, that mathematical reasoning might not be the foundation, it might be just a byproduct. Then mathematical reasoning today is very formalized, uses a very specific language. It's not always like that. The Greeks used to do mathematics in Greek, in text, no mathematical notation. And they were making their life sometimes very difficult. Like, for instance, after discovering that square root of 2 is not rational, the kind of text, they started to distinguish length from numbers as different objects, all in text, all in Greek. And to compare a length A with a length B, they had to prove that if you multiply the length A by a number alpha and the length B by a number beta, A alpha is greater than B beta only if alpha is greater than beta. And if that's the case, A and B are the same. So there's quite complicated reasoning to describe length. All this in Greek, pages. That was very difficult, didn't go too far. 10 centuries later, 15 centuries later, Euler, a very learned man, he knew all the Greeks, had read all of them, you can trust it. He knew that there was something fundamentally bizarre in the world of numbers that they didn't understand. And he decided to do something very pragmatic. Well, first invent a notation, and he's basically the father of the mathematical notation, which is a subset of natural language, because everything you say in mathematical notation can be re-expressed in natural language, but the opposite is not true. But it's a compact subset that you can grasp more easily. And he invented trigonometry and a couple of things. And you can go over the history until the Dedekind cut, where you see plenty of variations with language, like slicing epsilons to define the limits, and then the Cauchy completion, and then the Dedekind cuts, and eventually you can solve the real problem, the problem of square root of 2, 20 centuries later. So when we do mathematics, we use a language that's different. It's more restricted, it's more compact, and this is why the mathematical books do not form a lot of gigabytes. And it also has a smaller distance between the things that you want to prove. And the reason why LLMs don't do that nowadays is because we don't have enough text to learn that. The LLMs are super inefficient in terms of text. Think about it. If you train, let's say, a Llama 3 model is something like 15 terabytes of data, something like that, is what they say. If you want to read it yourself, it's going to take you 1 million years. You haven't read for 1 million years, you read for 10 years, 15 years, and you can do a lot more. So clearly, there is something super inefficient in the way we do things. And because it's super inefficient, we're not able to take advantage of mathematical text. And that's it. Now, some people say, oh no, we not compete with human learning, we compete with all of evolutions. You have to understand it's nonsense. The genome is 4 gigabytes, half of which share with bananas, who are not known for thinking. And essentially, you have what, 100 megabytes in the genome to code what's in our brain? No more. So it's way, way, way smaller than the kind of data sets we use. So don't annoy me by saying we compete with all of evolution. There is a bottleneck there that's not very large. So yes, well, it's true. You can't argue with that number.
Do you think that in order to for large language models to be good fiction machines, do they need to learn internally a world model, and do they understand in their structure something like there are humans that have intentions and blah blah blah?
In that viewpoint, there are the world model. The world model is a story. The world model is the alternative storyline, the alternative timelines you can build in a story. And of course, you can make different kind of stories. You can have a story about the weather that's about the gods and their moods, or a story about the weather that's about Navier-Stokes, which is good only up to a certain scale, or a story about the weather that's about fronts and more abstract concepts that are maybe thermodynamic limits of something that's chaotic. And these stories have different values, different predictive values, and you have to choose the right one. That's the purpose of science. To find the right story, the one that best describes our world and that we can use to make predictions. This is what we do with experiments. So if you say the model is the story, you have just to choose the right one. It's not inside, you know. It's what it is.
Thanks. I don't know if it's my turn, but thank you so much for this presentation once again. I've maybe have two questions. A quick one, about the superintelligence not making a lot of sense. I'm guessing you're referring to strong superintelligence, not being hard or impossible, but at least with human data and human capacities, speed superintelligence would be still very likely, don't you think?
Well, look at the humans already. There are differences in intelligence between humans, but not that big. Frankly, the difference we see, they're more about education, more about the will to actually do things. I don't see that the difference of intelligence between humans is very big, frankly. So I don't expect much more.
Which I get. Okay, it's just like if the planet and the whole population being already essentially the superintelligence, the most intelligence we can have in one point, the entity with the most intelligence currently, if we can have a system that can emulate 8 billion average or even good human intelligences, that would make that new entity a super intelligence in its own right. We would be able to make ×2, then times whatever else, more intelligence at the end of the day. I'd like to know if you think that would still be possible or likely scenario.
Well, listen, you described a machine that would simulate all the humans and all the different point of views, all the conflicting stories. That's already a big machine. And you just double the stuff. But you're not going to double the stuff like this many times, right? There is nothing like an exponential growth there. Of course, you can have a machine that's going to take facts from different domains and maybe put them together a bit faster, but nothing we cannot understand. I mean, if we want to do AI, the thing that's going to happen is not that AI is going to become super smart. It's that the only way it can happen is we become smarter as well.
Makes a lot of sense.
You could invent machines maybe that invent their own language, their own stories. They don't share them with us. They don't share with us. I see this a long way forward, you know.
Okay. Thank you.
We're going to change biologically before this happens. Or we're going to blow the planet before this happens.
Hopefully not. So if the language models are world models, they're world models of story making.
They're tools to construct the theories which can be used as world models, okay, good or bad.
tools to construct the theories, and they go at generating different hypotheses, perhaps if we train instead of a fiction machine, if we train a fiction machine on sound reasoning, eventually we'll have a sound reasoning machine as well. But
right now we can't because we don't have enough reasoning data.
Because we don't have enough reasoning data, and we have much more fiction data, right?
Yeah.
But so these two things LLMs could possibly solve. Now there's the other thing that you said. Sometimes you need to make progress. It means we need very original stories. Right?
Yeah.
And where do we get them out? So one thing I see is like from I mean, if mathematical reasoning is not the foundation, but storytelling is the foundation, can be foundation of mathematical reasoning. There's other source for mathematical reasoning, which is our grounding in the physical world, and the grounding in perception and in geometrical constraints and all these things that are also used to get the mathematical insights, not just the verbal reasoning or description.
And when we access new perceptions, like we design new tools that allows us to see things that we didn't see before, we can make a new story. But in fact, when we build telescope and we see the planets around Jupiter, the moons around Jupiter, and then we're starting to make stories of circles and things like that, we readapt the stories that we have. No? We see quantum effects, and people have made story. There was the wave story, the Schrödinger story, the matrix story, and then we show that these stories are more or less equivalent. You see relativity and general relativity, and the stories about non-Euclidean space, they've been made before. People started to think about non-Euclidean space before even having a hint that they would exist. So it doesn't seem to me that it's obvious that the creation of stories is driven by new observations. I see the opposite, in fact. I see observations being explained by stories that we had built before, but probably it's like a chicken and an egg, right? It's connected. But I wouldn't put it, historically, it seems to be the other way around.
But the point I'm trying to make is that the reasoning, the mathematical reasoning, the grounding for the reasoning is not just verbal storytelling, but also like proto-geometric reasoning that's based on our perceptual system and our understanding of
well,
geometry.
That's a narrow understanding of geometry.
It is narrow.
Non-Euclidean geometry appeared long before we had any evidence that this was real. And if you take abstract geometry or geometric in metric spaces or arbitrary metric spaces, you have things that are really, really non-intuitive.
Yeah, they become so, but the grounding is still on part of our intuitive physics, grasping from our visual senses and our moving in the world, and not just from.
If you take
language.
generic metric spaces, I'm not sure it's grounded in an understanding of geometry. It's something else. It's grounded in some mixture of our experiences, but it's taking geometry to another level, another world already. And even if you think about geometry, for instance, even if you take Euclidean geometry, we understand well the 3D to some extent. We have some understanding of high dimensional because of concentration effects. The one that's really hard is even dimensions, small even dimensions, 4, 6. That's really hard. We get nothing there, or nearly nothing. We have no intuition for that. And yet there are plenty of mathematical facts that we're able to prove. Except that, of course, we prove just a very small fraction of what there is. If we had an intuition of 4D geometry, we would have a lot more results there. Yeah. I don't know, maybe there are some people doing mathematics who can tell me I'm wrong, but I don't think that's wrong.
Hello. I might be missing something trivial here, but I still do not understand what would be the logical or policy reasoning in this storyteller model that you presented. Like, for example, you said that we don't have the intuition about higher dimensions, but we still can verify proofs about higher dimensions. Is the intuition the storytelling, or I do not get it? Sorry.
Well, I can speak for myself. After 30 years of machine learning, when I consider a problem in 1,000 dimensions, I have a good idea of where things are going to concentrate. don't seeing everything, but intuitively I start to get it. If you ask me the same thing in 4 or 6 dimensions, nada, nothing, 0 or close to 0.
But I was thinking about geometric problems in 3 dimensions is usually very hard to work on. Like when we want to prove theorems on higher dimensions, it's
in
super
3
hard.
dimensions. In 3 dimensions, it's easy compared to 4. It's really easy compared to 3 dimensions. Tell you things like the inversion of the sphere. It's devilish.
So, if I understand correctly, you're saying that language models are bounded by the fact that they're trained on data generated by humans. I want you to maybe speculate on what you think would happen if these models, these large language models, or we can call it differently, were trained on the real world. Do you think that the kind of fictions that it could come up with could be superior than the one that we as humans come up with? And could they come up with also fictions more efficiently than the way that we come up with as humans?
Trained on the real world, what do you mean?
I mean, for example, there's groups that are trying to train these models on videos. So these are raw data.
Oh, perceptual. Oh, but you can make stories with visuals, right? It's not a problem.
But also by interacting in the world.
Well, interacting with the world is low bandwidth in general. If you think about the people doing error on larger scale, they try to simulate because doing actual interaction is, first of all, not enough, and second, dangerous.
Yeah, but if we put aside the danger aspect and just focus on the fact that maybe these machines could
still lack in bandwidth, right? No, you can only do so many experiments. Listen, take a baby. Baby is learning about the world. Don't tell me the baby experiments a lot. He just cannot even move. He's in the crib, he cannot move. Cannot experiment, right? And yet, at this stage, they're learning a lot. So you have to see that they're able to learn with very limited interaction with the world. And when we do standard reinforcement learning, we don't know how to do that. There are plenty of ideas to try to do better, but getting the kind of gain that we see has proven difficult. People spend their lives trying to do that. And so that's to be respected. So you can not even close.
Thank you for the talk. When you were discussing the purifiers, you had an example of how to jailbreak a language model. And I believe that you, if I understood your point correctly, you concluded that the mission of the purifiers was essentially futile because
this
there
is what
was
Borges says.
Sorry?
Borges says that the
Borges
purifiers
says,
are futile because for all the exactions,
right,
they didn't change. The action is just like a drop of water in the ocean. That's what Borges says. And to this, I'm going to oppose 2 things. When I try to transfer this to LLMs, I can see that jailbreaking is pretty easy. It's even entertaining. And if you block it, you can always find another way. And the most efficient way is to limit the interaction. Say, no, after 3 exchanges, we're not going to let you speak again because you're going to jailbreak me. Okay, that's weak, right? And it goes pretty much in the idea that if you try to constrain these machines, you're making them. Being able to say something that's not true, to say a variant, is something you need to be able to do to be smart.
Okay. Yes, but my question was more on the, I guess, societal side of it. Of you concluded that, in fact, what the purifiers were doing was essentially futile. Yes. Because there's infinite ways to jailbreak. And while this seems like it might be true on an individual potential level, it seems like what purifiers are doing could absolutely have an impact on the collective public discourse if they are influencing people's access to information. Like where you are erecting barriers to access is absolutely having an impact.
You do social engineering by forbidding certain talks.
We've seen it done in various places in the world.
In the story. Every time you have something who says you cannot speak about this, you cannot speak about that, it becomes a challenge for other people, and there is always the counter reaction. All taboos have been violated. That's the rest of taboos somehow. Basically, if you take human history, I don't think you can find an example where trying to prevent people from saying something prevented them from thinking it.
So purely anecdotal, but I recently came back from a country where, talking to a friend, there were conversations that were being had, say, 10 years ago, that are simply no longer being had. Maybe there's a small subset of the population that will still have them.
You can effectively prevent people from saying things by creating fear and everything. You twist up the population and everything. Just look in the big picture. It's coming back.
Not necessarily in the public discourse, but also in the private, because people will forget, right? Their window of possibilities will shift.
No, because the walls have ears, and you have to be careful.
Yeah, but perhaps just sharing my personal experience, having grown up in this kind of society here, actually people find so many different ways to talk to each other about what they want to say in coded ways that it's actually been really fun also to find how to find the jokes, to find the messages, to find the ways to communicate. So it's not apparent to somebody who's not from that, but it's very clear to somebody who is from that what we say certain things, that we say them in a way so that the ears of the walls can say it.
Or sometimes they can, but they cannot complain. Like Master and Margarita. It's a ferocious criticism of Stalinian era in a way that's quite subtle, but everybody understood, including Stalin. He was very pissed off. So, yeah, what you say is true, meaning that you can make the life of people miserable. But mankind has been going over that regularly. It doesn't work long term.
I hope you're right.
I hope I'm right too.
So you were mentioning this garden of books. You didn't say what happened when this fictional machine starts contributing to the garden of books. Yeah,
so that's interesting. It becomes one of us. So what the way I understand, it becomes one of us.
Thanks.
So LLMs are fiction machines. Are human also fiction machines? And if so, what is non-fiction in this context?
Humans are fiction machines. Well, you can listen to a lot of them, and yes, stories are not always. You can say fiction as being something incorrect or wrong, and you can say fiction as being a kind of second-degree model that might be true or not true, that might apply or not apply. And so, what's non-fiction? Well, in our minds, I'm not sure there is. because everything we observe from the world is the cavern of Plato. You know, we don't. When we reason on things that are measurements of the world that are not necessarily reliable. We reason about words or concepts or images, but the image that we form in our head is not the real thing.
We're able to make predictions.
We're trying to make predictions about the real world because we're trying to control our future and survive. Yeah, sure. In the domains of ideas, what is nonfiction is very conventional. It's things that we believe are true. You can look at maybe the most complete description of this is the notion of scientific truth. Scientific truth that we apply to the world is temporary, according to Popper. The scientific truth is something that we hold for true and that has not been contradicted yet. In our ideas. Now there is the real world, the one that we access only through our senses. And it can do things to you, like if everything blows up, fine.
So nonfiction exists from the human perspective. That's something subjective to humans. Maybe LLM has their own nonfiction, whatever that means.
Well, what I want to say is that nonfiction is a negative definition. If you say that fiction is everything, there is no nonfiction, right? If you say that fiction is only what's not true, it means that there is something you call nonfiction that you hold for true. And what you hold for true, well, could be simple facts, which are limited by whether you trust your senses or your devices, observation devices. And you might have theories which are true until proven otherwise. So in the context of trying to understand LLM, I'm not sure it's that productive to distinguish fiction from non-fiction. For our lives, it's probably important.
All right, so we're gonna end the talk. Let's thank again Léon.
Thank you very much. But I would like to say that this is all about trying to understand something I don't understand. Meaning, being challenged by what I'm seeing, LLMs, how they affect the population, trying to make sense out of them and decide what I want to research. So